The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
So guys, wakey wakey, I want you to complete this well-known phrase. You listening? I agree with. Can anybody complete that well-known phrase for me? For some of you, it's right on the tip of your tongue. You're like, surely he can't be saying that. I want you to shout it out if you can say it. I agree with. That isn't the one. That's not a well-known phrase. It's a given. I agree with Nick. There we go. I knew Mr. Political would get it. I agree with Nick. 2010, general election time. There were the TV debates, and it was Nick Clegg's moment of glory, right? A lot of you were still in school or diapers, but that's okay. Seriously, every single party leader was queuing up to say, during this debate, I agree with Nick. And very few people the next morning could remember anything Nick had said, except the fact that everybody else agreed with him. It's like people were queuing up to agree with nice, but middle of the road, ordinary man on the street, Nick. And that was, for me, that was the lasting memory of the 2010 election. I agree with Nick. If you type it into Google now, I typed it in last night, it was hilarious. I typed, I agree with, and Google completed the phrase for me. Amazing. Type, I agree with Nick, images, and there's loads of these images of his face with various different psychedelic colours behind. Still now, 7 years later, of I agree with Nick. I was tempted to print one out, but I didn't want to waste the ink. But every general election has its flavour. And of course, we've just had one, right? And Theresa May was really clear what she wanted the election to be all about. She wasn't she? She started out, it's like, I mean, it was called, everybody assumed she was unassailable. Everybody. And she wanted it to be about safe and secure leadership to take us through Brexit. I was listening to one guy saying the last person who ran a general election on the basis of their own person was Heath, and he got slaughtered for it. And he couldn't believe that she'd made this decision. But then there was this assumption, right, that she was unassailable. And she'd kind of tried to pitch it about one thing. And then there was a whole nother kind of propaganda campaign. There were other circumstances as well, but there was a whole kind of reaching of muscle of people redefining what the election was about. And it was basically pitched as this battle between good and evil, right? Yeah? Corbyn versus May. Harry Potter versus Voldemort. Skywalker versus Vader. Frodo versus Sauron. Arnie versus the Predator. She wanted the election to be about one thing, but my Facebook feed said it was all about welfare state. It was all about this woman that wanted to strip down the fabric of our society, as people wanted to put it, and then kind of Corbyn, the unsung superhero, single-handedly saving our NHS, our schools, and the elderly. He would even babysit your kids for the weekend if you asked him kindly. In the words of Trump, it's true, it's gonna be great. My American impression for you. I just found it fascinating. And by general election day, a few of you were posting, I can't wait for this election to be over so I can stop posting posts about Corbyn as the superhero. How many of you put that? Some of you definitely did. I mean, I read it on your Facebook pages. Fascinating how it got kind of reshaped. And it kind of started me thinking, where did this idea that it was the state's role to do all of that stuff kind of come from? Do you ever ask yourself that? Where did the idea come from? So, like, post-war Britain, there was this explosion of what we now call the welfare state. In 1942, a guy called Beveridge produced a report that said it was the state's responsibility to look after the people. Now, prior to that, there'd been this thing called the Poor Law, which goes right back to kind of Victorian Britain. And under the Poor Law, it kind of acknowledged that the state had a responsibility for looking after people. But it classified people in 4 categories. So it had the kids, it had the elderly and the infirm, it had those that had fallen upon difficult circumstances, and then the work shy. And that was the 4 categories. And the 3 categories first were to be helped, but the work shy were to be punished. I'm simplifying it to the point that it's almost not accurate anymore, but you get the idea. And then the 40s come along, and you've got kind of post-war Britain, and everybody's kind of, the whole world is being redefined, and suddenly the British government is held to account for the needs of many people who've been affected by the war in all sorts of different ways, through employment, through health, through education being kind of on hold, and out of that came what we recognise as the welfare state. And it was an incredible time where it was the beginning of the NHS, it was the beginning of sick pay, it was the beginning of annual leave, it was the beginning of pensions, it was the beginning of free education, it was the beginning of unemployment benefits, it was the beginning of national insurance. All these things that we take for granted now. And Britain actually at that time threw away a notion of those that deserved and those that didn't, and just said it was available to all. It was an absolute sea change. Interestingly, hugely influenced by the church, hugely influenced by Christian values about universal human dignity. Now our commitment to that has been shaken at times, particularly during the 1980s. It was really obvious. So during the 1980s, the NHS had been a victim of its own success, and it reached a point where people were living longer and it couldn't possibly keep up with demand. We recognise that from now, right? And at the same time, there was this concern that the welfare state had bred this culture of people where it wasn't in their interest to go out and find work. And at the same time, you kind of had Margaret Thatcher rolling back the state, making herself incredibly unpopular in certain quarters, but in other quarters, people saying that actually she was rescuing the economy. And so there was this debate at the time about what is the role of the state? How far-reaching should it be? To what extent is it responsible for the well-being of the most marginalised, of the most vulnerable? In 2015, David Cameron used this rather unfortunate phrase of a substantial underclass in Britain. And it invited us again to think about those that deserve the help and those that don't deserve the help. In some ways seem to be identifying a middle, a working and an upper class, and then a substantial underclass that in some way had chosen to opt out of the social norms. In our society, we face a whole load of issues. Right now, we've been in years of austerity. There's personal debt all around us. Benefit cuts, housing shortages, service cutbacks, unemployment, increasing economic inequality, substance abuse, gang culture, youth crime, trafficking, exploitation, just the list goes on. And people are kind of asking, whose fault is it? When disasters happen in London or Manchester, people are asking, whose fault is it? Who's to blame? Is it the government? Is it this government? Is it a past government? Is it just the world we live in? Did the bankers ruin it for everyone? Maybe the poor are to blame themselves. Are they work shy? Couch potato, Jeremy Kyle fodder? Are they some way cheating us? It feels like in some way there's a suspicion on all angles. A suspicion to those in need and a suspicion to those in power. And we're not quite sure where to step. And this long-running political debate that's been going on for hundreds of years about exactly where does the state fit in all of that. What is their role? Now here's my point. I don't think there's any room for such debate when it comes to the church. Now, many of us, when we were thinking about voting, were trying to think which party most reflects the values of the church. Now, in honesty, that you're never going to find a perfect fit because it just isn't there at the moment. So in some way, we have to recognize that actually what's going on over there is separate from the church, and that actually the purposes of the two they aren't the same. In 2007, there was a financial crisis in this country, and it was remarkable. It was remarkable in a lot of ways, but one of the ways it was remarkable is it began to open a door for a resurgence of the church in terms of complementing and working alongside the state and looking after the most poor in our society. And what nobody saw coming, and people are now commenting on and with real kind of surprise, is this notion of what they're calling Christian community franchise model. Christian community franchise model. And what it is basically is an organisation that spots a need and develops a model for changing that, for influencing that need, and then offers to partner with local churches to enable them to reproduce that franchise in their local community. Did you know we're a member of one of those? So when we're doing the food bank, actually we're one of those franchise models. The Trussell Trust is running that franchise model, and there's loads of them, and they're probably household names for you. Street Pastors, Eden, CAP, Community Money Advice, Hope for Justice, TLG. They're all this kind of community franchise model where people can take an off-the-peg model and start to influence their local community. In the 90s, it felt like the church had almost kind of disappeared from view. I don't know whether they'd retreated in terms of kind of supporting the needy. I don't know whether they'd retreated or whether they were relegated, whether the kind of increasing secularism meant that they were kind of pushed to the background. But certainly today, it feels like with the state wobbling, with confidence that kind of spending and spending and spending can't carry on, actually there's a real platform and an openness within the corridors of power and a recognition that the state can partner with the church. Archbishop John Armani stood up in the House of Lords and he said this. He warned that scroungers were a convenient scapegoat when it seems expedient to make sure somebody pays the price of the hardship that we're afraid of. The church has always been in the forefront of the challenge to speak and act prophetically, to give a voice to the voiceless and hope and help to those in need. Why would he say that? Well, when Jesus came to announce his own ministry, as a young man, he stood up in the temple and kind of went through the scriptures and, if you like, found a manifesto verse, found what he was going to say that would mark out his ministry. And these are the words that he chose. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of the sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." He could have chosen any verse, any phrase, any bit from the Jewish scriptures, and that's the bit he chose. Good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoner, recovery for the sick, and freedom for the oppressed. And throughout his life, we see that actually that wasn't just good politics. That wasn't just a soundbite. That was in his very nature. That was who he was. And I want us to draw in this morning to a passage where we see it on display. So if you want to turn to Mark 5 with me, you can. I'm going to read it, so don't worry if you haven't got a Bible with you. So Jesus is traveling with his disciples, and they came to the other side of the sea, the country of Gergesenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs. No one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." This is a man living among the tombstones, living alone, on the other side of the water, away from all community, afflicted by an unclean spirit, angry and unsoothable, so tormented that he was unrestrainable. He could not be subdued. He was unable to sleep and so would spend the night crying out, not just a gentle whimper, but roaring at the night skies whilst cutting himself with stones. We aren't told how he got there. We're just told that he's totally alone. He's branded unclean. He's branded afflicted, untreatable, untamable, unlovable. We aren't told what he was like as a child, whether he was a challenging kid. We aren't told how his parents treated him. We don't know whether he was always like this or whether it was some kind of trauma that impacted him. We aren't told what life choices he made. But we can assume that his anger and his uncontrollableness just drove away those that were closest to him and drove him out of community. We're told that people tried tying him up, even chaining him. And I wonder why. Maybe to stop him breaking things or stop him from hurting things. Maybe to administer medical treatment or some kind of deliverance. Or maybe just to ship him out. But it feels like this tragic mix between brutal medieval medicine and maybe the fear that meets the Incredible Hulk in Hollywood movies. And that fear and ignorance has turned this man into an isolated creature. This community has essentially abused him and kicked him out rather than care for him. For clarity, I am drawing a parallel here between the way society treats its most vulnerable. I'm not saying if you're employed, sick, or have maybe some mental health difficulties or some behavioural difficulties, therefore that you're necessarily influenced by an evil spirit. I'm not drawing that link. In your small groups, you don't need to start to discuss the merits of that. It's a blind alley. But what I am talking about is how society treats those that are most marginalised. And then causing us to think, how do we as a community treat those that are most vulnerable? It's tragic, isn't it, when we meet families where everything that could possibly have gone wrong has. It's tragic when we look at shocking circumstances like a fire in a tower block and we realise that those sorts of crises, they always hit the poor hardest. That there are whole communities around this city where people's stories are just tormented. It just feels like there is no break. There's no let-up. You just go from circumstance to circumstance to circumstance. It just seems to get harder and harder and harder. And it almost feels like sometimes there's just a bit of a systemic injustice. And that's what we see here. It's a systemic injustice. They didn't know what to do with him, so they tied him up and shipped him out. And when he meets Jesus, he sees another religious leader that's going to come and intervene. And what does he say? Don't torment me. My prayer is that the church in this city and we as a church would never be a place where those who are afflicted and vulnerable feel tormented. It just can't be. It must be a place of love and acceptance. But the truth is, it costs to love people, doesn't it? And it costs to love people when their behaviour pushes you away. If nothing else, it challenges the way we do church. It challenges our precious Sunday morning routines. It challenges how we show hospitality to those that might exploit it or might unsettle our lives or even scare our kids. But somehow we've got to work that through because doing nothing isn't an option. In this situation, Jesus is incredible. I mean, the Bible's really understated in the description, but when you read it, like the whole society's there behind him, and they're like, you just don't need to bother with him. We've spent a lot of years with him, and we've just parked that one. You're not fixing that. And there's a whole load of noise coming from the man himself, and his appearance, no doubt, was off-putting, and the smells would have been off-putting, and the scars would have been off-putting, and the shouting would have been off-putting, and the tombstones would have been off-putting. But Jesus just sees right through it all and just has this most remarkable authority. There's no screaming or yelling or shouting. There's nothing out of control. It's just simply healing and release for this man. We see this man later on, and the Bible described him as clothed and in his right mind. And the transformation is so astounding that people are afraid. So astounding that the community are afraid of what has gone on. And they are afraid of Jesus. That is how astounding the transformation is. Jesus brings healing and freedom and hope. And he has commissioned his followers, his friends, his church to go and do what he did. So doing nothing isn't an option. Now, those of you that know the passage, you know that I stopped reading at a certain point, right? It's because I wanted to focus on the relationship between Jesus and the man. There's a point afterwards where Jesus casts the demons into the pigs. Yeah, I did just use the D word, didn't I? The reality is we do believe in a spiritual realm. We do believe that there are influences in people's lives that can sometimes tie people up, and it feels like evil can attach itself to evil. And we have to be discerning where that's the case and where it's not. But the good news is Jesus, in this case, he was quite clear on it. But the question that always comes back is, why the pigs? Why did he throw the demons into the pigs and the pigs go over the cliff? Why do it that way? I read a couple of commentaries because I didn't really know. And there's loads of really interesting theories about what's going on in the spiritual realm at some point. And some of them are like more valid than others. But let me just throw a slightly different thought, kind of think about it more in terms of the people that we're talking about here. Because often I realize Jesus sees the heart of the people that he's surrounded by. He sees the heart of the community. And often when he's responding not just to what's on the surface, but responding right in under the heart. And their reaction when Jesus releases this man is really telling. They don't celebrate in any way. They're not even remotely bothered that this man has been set free after many years of torment. I wonder how many of them lived close enough that they could hear him howling at night. Even for that alone, I would have been grateful that he'd done something. Great, a good night's sleep, because he's going to be quiet for once. There isn't a single moment where they stop and go, high five to you, man. We've been trying to do that for years. Not a moment. But they ask Jesus to leave because he's damaging the local economy. You see, those pigs relate to cash. It wasn't that their kids had named them. It wasn't that they were emotionally attached to them. It wasn't that they were animal rights campaigners. Those pigs were the local economy. And when I say Jesus sees the heart of the people, what I'm saying is he knew that they were prioritizing cash at this moment over the joyous freedom of one vulnerable child of God. And I think in some way he's speaking to their heart. Elsewhere in the Bible, we see Jesus turning over tables when they've turned the house of God, a place that should have been about prayer, into making money and exploiting the vulnerable. And we see Jesus angry. And I wonder whether it's a similar righteous anger that we see here. Whether there's a part of Jesus that just wants to say to them, do you know what, guys? You should have spent less time labeling him as cursed and more time praying and ministering. That you should have been sacrificial in caring for this guy. That you were still bringing sacrifices and burnt offerings to God while this man was alone in the tombstones. That you were quietly lying in your beds, congratulating yourself for your piety and religious observance. And meanwhile, out among the tombstones is this man howling at the sky and cutting himself. I find the clash of interests really disturbing. Because I know, I wrote this talk and I'm standing there singing away and I'm thinking, I wonder what the needs are within a stone's throw of this building. There's probably a guy on a street within a stone's throw. There's probably a lady on a street corner somewhere within a stone's throw. There's probably a drug addict going to school somewhere within a stone's throw. There's probably a battered wife in a flat somewhere nearby within a stone's throw. But it's okay, this is just a story, right? This is just one of those stories where we read it and it shows Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and we can celebrate who Jesus is, and then we don't have to worry because people don't behave like that anymore. People don't howl at the sky anymore, do they? That's all right. We can maybe just leave that. Recently I was at work, came out the building at the end of the road. There's a man looking incredibly dishevelled, clearly in distress, rocking backwards and forwards with his arms at his side, howling at the sky. I thought people didn't behave like that anymore. I thought somehow we'd suss that. Just the other night, me and Luke came home, and there's a guy walking along the street every 20 yards. He stops on his crutches, sits on the floor, and kind of bangs his foot because it's too painful to walk, and starts swearing and effing jeffing at nobody. So I start to kind of engage him in a bit of conversation to find out what's going on, and you realise that actually this man is at odds with everybody. He's at odds with the medical services, he's at odds with the housing, he's at odds with the job centre, he's at odds with the benefits agency. He is out of the community, he is out of the loop. And I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going up there, and he told me the name of a place, and I realised in my head, mental chitty from having run there, it's about 4 miles. I said, how are you going to get there when you can't even go 20 metres? He's like, I'm ex-military, I'll get there one way or another. It's like, how does a guy who was 1 minute at the centre of society, serving our country, find himself on the outside? It's okay, it's just a story, right? Doesn't happen anymore. Welfare state's got it all sus. I think the difficulty is sometimes the Christian church, it lacks proximity. It lacks proximity to those that are in need, and so what it does is it either breeds ignorance or it breeds prejudice. We either think it's not there or we stop caring. Jesus said to his disciples, you will always have the poor with you. You can help them any time you want. He expected that we would be in proximity to the poor on an ongoing basis. And in the narrative in here, there is no hint of Jesus deciding whether the man deserved it or not. There is no hint of him deciding whether he is deserving or undeserving. Jesus aligns himself with the marginalised and the broken. And do you know what? I love him for it. I honour the kingship of God. I marvel at his splendour and the beauty of creation. I'm in awe of his spine-tingling purity and holiness. But it is the compassion and unswerving commitment to the broken and worthless that when I see it, it ruins me time and again. Because Jesus aligned himself with the broken. I love him for that. I love him that he aligns himself with the broken. In the early days of our church, God repeatedly spoke to us about loving the unlovely. In Micah, it says there is a unique call placed upon God's people to act justly and to love mercy. In Zechariah, it says we're instructed by the Lord Almighty himself to administer true justice, to show mercy and compassion to one another, to not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigners or the poor. That's our mandate. It's our commission. It's who we're meant to be. Because the gospel compels us to align our hearts to God's heart, and Jesus aligns himself with the broken. And the amazing thing is, it's not just our effort that we're offering. Because being nice isn't just something that's exclusive to Christians. In fact, there are people out there in the city that are much better at being nice than me. Much better. But actually, we have access to the same power that raised Jesus. We have access to the same authority that enabled Jesus to look into this situation and discern exactly what was going on. We have access to the same Father to be able to bring freedom and hope into people's lives. That we're not to reduce ourselves to just a social services spin-off. We're not to reduce ourselves to just a freebie social action project. That we are to be the family of God, bringing hope to people's lives. For a while, the food bank has been our project, and it's grown at just the most colossal and amazing rate. And to be honest, we've struggled to keep up with it. It's kind of gone galloping, which is incredible. But as part of our vision process that Matt mentioned last summer, God spoke to us about being a city church at the heart of local communities. And he spoke to us about building local hubs of believers that were right at the heart of local communities. And as such, we committed ourselves to building mercy projects or social action or engaging with the vulnerable of our communities. And we're just in the process of working out what that looks like, and already it feels like kind of God is racing ahead of us. Already you've got kind of the Caps and Scott and their team out on the streets of Manchester, just befriending the homeless, sometimes bringing food, but most powerfully sitting down alongside them. Often when you see kind of people walk past the homeless, they're kind of shaking their heads, maybe not looking them in the eye, steering their kids away, but as the family of God choosing to sit down next to somebody and listen to their story. Already we've got Jenny going off on exploratory missions with the Welcome Box project, finding out how we can look at serving refugees. How we can look at providing some kind of welcome to people that find themselves stranded and isolated in a community that isn't their own. I would encourage you, is that still happening this afternoon? After this meeting, there's a meeting downstairs where Jenny is going to kind of report back on her findings. I would encourage you to be there. Even if you haven't got capacity to put a single item in a single box, be there anyway. Align yourself in the same way as Jesus does. Similarly, we're at the early stages of chatting with an organisation called Safe Families for Children, which is set up to prevent young people from ending up on child protection plans, to prevent young people from finding themselves in family breakdown and crisis, supporting parents. And it's amazing talking about how the church, being the church, can just bring hope to those families. Already God is running ahead of our strategy and our planning, and we're just kind of playing catch up. Because we have this commitment that we will act justly and love mercy. Because we will treat the least of our brothers and sisters as a sign, as an indicator of our love for Jesus. That we think that the way we treat the broken and the hurt and the marginalised is just as much, if not more, of a sign of our love for Jesus and the volume of our singing and the correctness of our theology. Just as much, if not more, a sign of our affection for Jesus, that we love the ones that he chooses to love. Reality is, once I was a long way away from God, because of my behavior. I was chasing things that he would not have had me chase. But now I'm reconciled to God, free from blemish and free from accusation. And while I was still a long way off, he loved me. This is how I even know what love is, because Christ loved me first. When I was 19, I began to feel like I had no cause. I had no purpose. I was striving, but had no idea where I was striving to or what I was striving for. That is an empty, broken cycle. And I believe God was speaking to my heart in that time. That my Father helped me to see that I was broken, but called me to wholeness. He loved me when I was broken. God's mercy came to me when I did not deserve it. I couldn't earn it, make it, or achieve it. His mercy was free to me. And this is the reality of the way mankind first encounters the living God and his good news. And if I can experience the good news of Jesus even when I was far off and running for the hills, with all the benefits that entails, then I can show his mercy on the same basis to the people of this city. We don't have all the answers. We don't sit here saying we're all together and sorted and other people out there are broken. We start from a position of brokenness ourselves, and we know that there is one answer that is so profound and so life-changing, and it is that Jesus aligns himself with the broken. I want to invite you to stand with me now, because we had a verse read to us from Ezekiel that invited us to prophesy over dry bones. Dry bones don't stay together. They are broken. They are little pieces. And if they stay there long enough, they get all jumbled up on the floor. And Ezekiel is invited to prophesy over them that they might reassemble, realign, come back together, and come to life. And somebody once told me that the basis, the starting point of prophecy is looking at a broken situation and believing that it does not have to remain broken. And so that's what we're going to do. There will be elements of your home life, your community, your street, your workplace, your family, maybe homelessness, maybe trafficking, maybe youth culture, maybe domestic abuse, whatever it might be that resonates with you in this moment. I just want you to begin to speak to God and say that it does not have to remain broken. We're going to do that all together. We're not going to be worried about what the person next to us is saying, but we speak over the communities around Greater Manchester and say they do not have to remain broken. Would you join me in that? Can we do that together? Yeah, Jesus, we love you for who you are. We love your compassion. We love how much you love those who had nothing to offer. Lord, we choose to align ourselves with you. Lord, not with a political party, not within a philosophical notion, but with you. To love mercy, to love justice, to love freedom, to love hope, and to bring it wherever it's needed. Thank you, God. And Lord, we pray for these fledgling projects. Lord, if they're of you, I pray they fly. If they're not, if you want us to set our foot somewhere else, God, would you speak to us? Would you close those doors? But Lord, I pray that we would be characterized as a city that loves Jesus and aligns ourselves with the broken. Thank you, God.